Welcome everyone to the third year of our Breakthroughs in Water Security series. My name is Jeff McDonald. I'm a professor in SENS and the Associate Director of the Global Institute for Water Security. Welcome our live audience and also our YouTube listeners. And we have a terrific lineup this year. We've shifted the time a wee bit. We're starting earlier, of course. We'll be in this room and at this time over the next 10 weeks or so. As always, we want to thank Howard Weider, the Canada Excellence Research Chair and the Global Institute for Water Security for funding and underwriting this seminar series. And today I have the real pleasure of welcoming Anne Nolin. Anne is a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science at Oregon State University. Anne's PhD is in snow hydrology from UC Santa Barbara in 1993, where she worked with Jeff Dozier, a real titan in the field of snow hydrology. And since then, Anne has become herself internationally recognized expert and world leader in snow remote sensing. And you'll hear a little bit about this today. She served as chair of the AGU Cryosphere Focus Group. She's a member of the NASA Advisory Council for Earth Science, the Earth Science Subcommittee. And she's a NASA team member. This is quite important for the new multi-angle imaging spectral radiometer, and you might hear something of that today as well. She's been an Erskine Fellow at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and she was a Landau Endowed Chair for Sustainable Futures at EPFL in Lausanne. And her work with her PhD students and postdocs is really leading the way in trying to understand how to remotely sense snow, how forests interact with snow, and increasingly moving into other larger water resource issues with at-risk snow and the change that many environments are encountering in terms of snow to rain transition. So please help me in welcoming Anne.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. I want to say it's a real pleasure to be up here in Canada. I had the pleasure of talking to quite a few of the students and postdocs and faculty today. It's great to talk about snow and ice, and because I love snow. I love snow and I love mountains. Sorry, no mountains here, but your water all comes from the mountains, right? That's where this great river comes from. So broadly speaking, my research focuses on snow and ice in the climate system and how snow and glaciers melt and become water for forests, ecosystems, and for people and communities that depend on the water. And I'll be touching on that community aspect later on. The first part of the talk is really focusing on some interesting technological aspects having to do with remote sensing of snow. But to set the stage for this is a plot that's showing declining spring snow, and spring snowpack is the snow that really serves as the moisture subsidy for our ecosystems. It's the snow that lasts into the dry season out west, and if we don't have that snow at the beginning of the dry season, we get stressed forests, we get more forest fires, and as you can see here, there is this downward decline in March and April snow, but especially in this red line, that's June snowpack, and the solid line is from the satellite record. So satellites really provide a significant data source for us. This is northern hemisphere snow. The questions that I'm going to be talking about today a bit, but my research group focuses on more broadly, is how much snow is coming from snowpacks and glaciers? How might this change in the future? So there's a measurement quality to it for the present and past, but also in predictive quality into the future. What are the impacts of these changes then of climate changing climate on snowpacks? And then lastly, I'm really interested in this idea of coupled natural human systems, or what are also called social ecological systems. The idea that that environmental systems don't exist in a vacuum, right? There's snow hydrology and people. So I'm really going to talk about the snow hydrology at the beginning, and then I'll talk about snow hydrology and the people part towards the end. One of the important aspects of the human dimension here is the idea of developing anticipatory capacity. That is, we cannot predict the future. We cannot know really what's going to happen in the future, but we can develop capacity to anticipate what might happen, and this might be the idea of developing alternative future scenarios so that we can have the capacity to either mitigate or adapt to those future scenarios. So this idea of anticipatory capacity is really important. But in order to develop anticipatory capacity, we need to be able to measure the important components of our system. And today I'm going to be talking mainly about snow, but a lot of what I say here could also be applied to glaciers or ice sheets or sea ice, other elements of the cryosphere system. So this first half of the talk is really focusing on new ways, not just all ways, but just basically some new ways of remote sensing of snow for snow hydrology. And I'm going to talk about new ways of thinking about what we already have, existing methods, new methods that are emerging that are currently in airborne form. They might remain airborne, or we might be able to transition them to satellite. We also have some technologies that are on the horizon. And then also, we can't do everything with remote sensing. We need to fill the gaps. How do we do that? We have to link with physically based models. So this is an example of how we can use existing methods of remote sensing in new ways to produce information that is perhaps higher quality, higher use, or more accessible than traditionally is the case. And so here's an example from California. This is provided by my colleagues Jeff Dozier and Tom Painter. Tom is at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and Jeff Dozier is at UC Santa Barbara. And so here is kind of a false color, or sorry, this is a false color image of the California Sierra Nevada. Red is vegetation, white is snow. Over here we have elevation, so as it gets a lighter colored and this brownish, that's highest elevation. Over here is something interesting, fractional snow-covered area. So the pixels, the picture elements, or a grid cell, if you would, in a satellite image. The traditional way of making this measurement would be either to say it's either snow-covered or it's not snow-covered. That is, it's either 100% snow-covered or 0 snow-covered. Honestly, you're almost always wrong if you're saying it's either 100 or 0. Snow is usually not one or the other. It's almost always somewhere in between, and that's the case with a lot of remote sensing. That's one of the reasons why we want to use fractional snow-covered area, because patchy snow might show up as 0, but it's the patchy snow at low elevations that's important for snow hydrology. That melts off early. We might have 70% snow cover at high elevations if you've got wind scouring, but that would show up as 100% snow, and if that's the case, then we might overestimate the late season flow, the high elevation snow that melts later. So we really do want to have fractional snow covered area. It's been a very difficult problem, something that I actually worked on early on in my dissertation work in the early 90s, and now has finally come to fruition as an operational product. Here's fractional snow covered area, and another interesting component here is grain size. You can measure snow grain size from space, knowing something about the principles, the first principles in the physics of the reflection of light from snow. So kind of cool. The reason we care about snow grain size is because it's a good indicator of the thermodynamic state of snow. You know, large grain size usually means it's melting. Fine grain is that nice new fluffy snow that we like to ski on. But it also governs the albedo, that is the overall reflectivity of the snow. So where is the snow and how much snow is there? That's why we care about the fractional snow cover. And grain size tells us something about the thermodynamic state, and from that we can get the albedo of the snow. And since absorption of solar radiation, how much sunlight's absorbed by the snowpack, is so important for governing how quick it melts, we need to know that for our hydrologic models. So these data are great, they're new, and now they're available in near real time in all places where we have these squares mapped out in black. So not everywhere in the world, but a lot of important places where we have mountains and snow. I don't mean to diss the snow that you guys have here in the prairie provinces, but you guys have the easy problem, right? Not a lot of trees, and it's pretty flat. The hard problems in snow occur in the mountains where you have really complex, heterogeneous terrain, sometimes a lot of trees that even cover up, obscure the snowpack. So places like this, it's really nice to be able to have the fraction of snow cover. So a couple of new technologies, or technologies that have been around in airborne form, but we anticipate that they'll eventually be in satellite-based form. Hyperspectral imaging, which means lots and lots of wavelengths that we're able to really sample the reflectivity of snow from the visible through the near infrared really completely. And from that, we can get grain size and albedo. Hey, what color is snow? You guys know? What is it? White. No, you're wrong. It's blue. If we really had good hyperspectral imaging with our eyes, we would know that indeed snow is blue. And if we had even more interesting hyperspectral vision with our eyes, and this is something Jeff Dozier always says, if we could see in the near infrared, people would go out of their way in the spring. There would be tours of snow because the snow would look so colorful and interesting. It's like going to see the fall colors, right? So snow is not always white. It looks really interesting as grain size changes, as it undergoes change in thermodynamic state. So hyperspectral imaging is really important. And from that, you can even tease apart whether or not the snow is melting. You can even get an idea of the liquid water content. In fact, you can simultaneously observe in an atmospheric column and a snowpack all three phases of water, liquid, gas, and solid, using hyperspectral imaging spectrometry. So cool stuff. A second method, again, now currently being done using airborne methods, but we would love to be able to get this back in space using a nice LiDAR, or laser light attenuation, light detection and ranging. It's an altimeter that uses light pulse, and then it records the amount of time it takes for that light pulse to get back to the sensor. It's like a big accounting method. You're tracking all these light pulses. And what's really interesting about it, these little pieces of the light pulses can actually get past the forest canopy. So even when there is a moderately dense forest, you can still sense the snow between the branches of the trees, and to some extent between the trees. So works well for forest canopies. Here it's shown, in this diagram, it's shown on a relatively flat surface. It does work in mountainous areas. You have to be a little more careful about that, but it works pretty well. So we use a differencing method. You measure the landscape with the snow off, and then you measure the landscape with the snow on, and you do that repeatedly, maybe as the snow is melting, and you can get the change in the depth of the snowpack over time. And if you know the depth of the snowpack by this difference method, and if you have an estimate of density, the depth times the density gives you the snow water equivalent, which is the depth, if in per unit area, usually in millimeters of water. So if you instantaneously melted that snow, how much water is available? That tells you about the amount of storage that's available per unit area. And what we'd like to do is really calculate the storage in maybe a whole watershed or an elevation zone that's important for our hydrologic modeling. So depth is really important, and if we know density, perhaps from a model, then we can get at snow water equivalent. So here are perhaps some of the points where we can measure those depths in the landscape, and this might be what it looks like after you've reconstructed that. Maybe you remove the forest artificially from your landscape that you're mapping, or maybe you leave the trees in to make this pretty picture like we've done here. One of the ways that this is currently being used, though this is existing technology being put to use for snow hydrology, for water resource management, is through my colleague Tom Painter and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, funded by NASA and partially by the state of California, in the Tuolumne River Basin in California. As you know, California has been hit by this terrible drought, multiple years of drought, the worst year on record of snowpack. In fact, the worst year probably in the last 1,000 years on record in the California Sierra Nevada. And they're able to map using hyperspectral imagery to map albedo and also, dust and soot that's in the snow, and also to use LiDAR, light detection and ranging, to map snow depth and use a model to get density. They're able to map the radiative qualities of the snowpack and where it is and how deep it is and how much water is in it, how much water is represented by that. So this is just a watershed scale, I shouldn't say just, this is a watershed scale project, and it's really cool and it's working really well, and it's helping decision makers make informed decisions about whether or not to release water from important reservoirs that govern irrigation and provide water for San Francisco. So here's an example of one of the maps, in this case snow water equivalent in meters, and the blue is the snow. This is the Tuolumne Basin. February 17th, here's March. You can see as the blue gets darker, that means there's less snow water equivalent. So this is last year. This was really bad last year. February, March, late March, April. Oh, it snowed a little bit. How do we know? Well, we have a little bit, we can see the snow, but how deep is it? Not very deep. Snow water equivalent is very low here. So just a skiff of snow in the whole basin. And by April 15th, very little left. Melted off very quickly after that small snowstorm there. Really no respite. This shows the difference between 2014, which at that point they thought was the worst year on record, and this is the difference between that year and this year. It was really, really bad. So they're really talking about a quarter of a meter difference between the previous worst year and this past year. So it's really not much snow stored in those mountains. Okay, moving on. The next technology, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but the next couple of slides are on radar. And so this is fairly high frequency radar, and KU is a radar that tells you, it sort of reflects from, it backscatters from the volume of snow, and it can tell you something about the snow pack volume and snow water equivalent for dry snow only. And this again has been used on the ground, in the air, in unvegetated places. Not yet in a satellite, but we hope sometime soon it will be. In this mode, it's a rotating synthetic aperture radar. That's what SAR stands for. And again, radar is an active sensing. It's a pinger, right? It sends out a pulse of radar energy, kind of like your microwave. This is Lband Interferometry. This is another radar instrument. And interferometry, in this case, that what they're doing is they're looking at R as the range from the top of the from the instrument to the top of the snow, and then they actually are able to, the L-band penetrates the snowpack and bounces off the bottom, and they look at the refraction that the snowpack creates for this longer wavelength radar. It's very different from KU band. KU is short and it scatters in the volume. L band is long, and so it turns out that it refracts, and so you have this difference that you can calculate, but it's calculated based on the phase of the wavelength, so you get like centimeter scale differences that you can detect. So again, this is very preliminary still. We hope to get this working in space, but the theory is there, the idea is there, and honestly, if we can get this working, that's kind of the holy grail of snow, is to be able to use microwave radar to measure snow depth to get snow water equivalent. And why radar as opposed to some other method like visible or infrared? Well, because radar goes through clouds, and snow is created by clouds. So if there's snow on the ground, you're probably in kind of a cloudy-ish place. And so there are a lot of clouds in the mountains. We want to know where the snow is in the mountains. Ideally, we'd like to be able to use some sort of radar-based approach. And also the footprint size is appropriate for the scales of interest that we're wanting to look at here. Here's an example of what some of these snow depths look like. This is just from Airborne. This is in Alaska on the North Slope, if any of you have been up around the Kuparuk River Basin near the Tulik long-term ecological research site. And so these are just different dates. So, you know, over the course of a week or couple weeks in March, where you can see changes in snow depth in this area. So it works from Airborne. This is just research mode. Again, this is something that's kind of on the horizon, a technology that looks very promising. And these are all the different kinds of technologies that this NASA-funded International Snow Remote Sensing Working Group has been working on. And our goal with this working group is to develop a snow mission that we can launch in space, but also have something that's more at the watershed scale. So maybe it's a combination of an airborne system with a spaceborne system, so that we can get at global scale processes on repeat orbits, but also for opportunities like the Airborne Snow Observatory, flying basins at appropriate scales at appropriate times of the year. And then also be able to use that as a template, so we could use it for any watershed where there's snow. So we could develop it in one place, but it would be cheap enough, or we could lend it out to other watersheds, other countries. So that's an idea that we have in mind for this. Lastly, I want to say that we've so far been talking about trying to measure the integrated value of the snow, but this hasn't really addressed anything about, well, what's going on in that snowpack anyways, right? Because sometimes for other purposes, not just hydrology, we care about the layers in the snowpack. If you're a wildlife ecologist, you care about whether or not there are big ol' ice lenses on top or within your snowpack, because whether it's caribou or moose or Dall sheep or elk, they need to be able to paw down to their forage for grazing. Polar bear denning also is affected by the structure of the snowpack, but also we want to know about the structure of the snowpack for energy balance considerations. Different layers melt at different rates. This frequency modulated continuous wave radar approach could allow us to peek into the snowpack and get an idea of what those layers look like. And this is an instrument that has been dragged along behind a sled and behind snowmobiles, or flown in a helicopter has also been successful. John Pomeroy's student has recently developed an acoustic sensor that uses a similar principle. So very exciting stuff on the horizon here. But we can't do it all with remote sensing. There are a lot of issues. Number one, forests. Let me say, number one is heterogeneity. It's really tough. We live in a 3D world, and yet this image here, behind here, does not show anything about the topography. This is a mountain environment with a lot of patch cuts. This is in Oregon. And when we're looking at remote sensing, it doesn't show anything, any aspect of the 3D nature, either of the topography or of the vegetation that might be obscuring the snow. So I would say that 3D heterogeneity is the most important challenge that we have facing remote sensing and modeling in snow hydrology. So clouds above the landscape, obscuring the landscape, forests obscuring the snow and interacting with the snowpack, topography, of course, governing where the snow lies and how long it persists, and governing all of the spatial and temporal scales at which we need to sample the snow. Remote sensing, oftentimes we're kind of at a fixed scale, whether it's 25 kilometer pixels or 1 meter pixels. We can't go up there and tweak the instrument in space. You have to decide beforehand what's the important scale. And you're kind of constrained by orbital parameters too. Maybe your orbit repeats every 2 weeks, or maybe you have a really wide swath on your orbit so that you can image your area once every day or two. But still, those parameters are fixed, and you have to decide beforehand what's important in temporal and spatial scaling. And lastly, these are measurements. They're not going to help you predict. It's a model that allows you to predict. So the modeling component's really important here. And that leads to this kind of complicated diagram, which don't necessarily look at the parts of it. It's something that I created for a proposal a little while back, but which got funded, which was cool. So some work that we're doing in Alaska, in which we're using a model called Snow Model, but we're going to be assimilating remote sensing data, the fractional snow-covered area, We're assimilating snow water equivalent from in situ measurements of snow on the ground from snowpack telemetry sites. And we're going to be assimilating albedo from a remote sensing product as well into the model. These are important things. We also are assimilating meteorologic data into the model and to some extent getting these from gridded data sets, and we also have to use a digital elevation model and land cover data. But out of that comes our idea of what's happening with the snowpack. How is it evolving over time on a daily basis? And then we're going to update that and check it, validate it with remote sensing and in situ data from snow surveys and from 30-meter spatial resolution data. But the important part here is that the model helps us understand how snowpacks evolve and how their properties change over time. We can't do it all with remote sensing. So models help fill the gap. But remote sensing helps fill gaps that we have in the models. We have to initialize it. We have to validate it. So it's a hybrid approach. We really think of it as bidirectional in that sense. They're each filling each other's gaps. How are we doing? Did I lose you yet? You're doing okay? All right. Okay, now we're going to change to the idea of breakthroughs in how we use models. That last slide was on my modeling segue. Now we're going to change to social ecological systems modeling. That is, well, how does snow matter to people and ecosystems? You know, how do we put it all together to create information that people can use? And so we want to build anticipatory capacity. We need to consider how these things link together. Hydrology, climate, land use, also the economics of the system, policy, governance, what are the agencies that are involved, what are the rules that are maybe fixed in place or perhaps fungible, what are the scales that we need. And to do that, we don't show up as scientists and go, I'm here to help you. All right, so I'll tell you what you need to do. No, our job is to work with managers, with policymakers, with decision makers to co-design the product, to co-develop the model, and to co-create the knowledge that's important to really meet the needs of the decision makers. We're not doing this for ourselves. I mean, we love science. I like doing all this, but I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this work, this modeling work, this social ecological systems modeling, so that we can inform decision makers, that they are fully informed about the science, that they understand the model, not maybe how to program it, but they understand because they're part of the development of that process. So this idea of co-design, co-development of and co-production of knowledge is really key here. So about 5 years ago, Jeff was still at Oregon State, and he was the fearless leader of a project that became known as the Willamette Water 2100 project. It's a project funded by the Water Sustainability and Climate program at the National Science Foundation in the US, a 5-year project, and we're just starting our 6th year, so 5 plus 1. And it's asking these key questions, sort of in shorthand: where, when, and under what conditions might water scarcity emerge? In this water-rich place, the Willamette River Basin, where I live, in fact, where 70% of Oregon's population lives, and in fact, where 70% of Oregon's economy exists. So we had tremendous support going into the development of that proposal before we even sent it into NSF. We had county commissioners, we had water managers, we had people from watershed councils, we had everybody up to the governor of Oregon writing letters of support for us. That was the investment that we had from our stakeholders. And then when we got funded, the first thing that we did was we developed what was called a learning action network. So we want to learn from each other so that we can take action together in this network and to co-create the knowledge that we need to support our decision makers. So here's what the Willamette River Basin looks like. The Willamette River flows from south to north. It has a confluence with the Columbia River Basin at Portland, and the Columbia then flows out to the Pacific Ocean, and it forms the border there between the state of Washington and the state of Oregon. This is where I live in Corvallis, and Corvallis stands for Heart of the Valley, and it really is right down in the middle of the valley. And most of the water is flowing down from the mountains. These are the Cascade Range along here, the Oregon Cascades. It's a volcanic range that's formed by subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate under the Pacific plate there. And so the purple areas are the urban areas. The sort of tan-colored are the sort of the valley grass and shrublands and agricultural lands. And the green are the forests, and the darker green, it gets the more dense and sort of bigger the trees are. So you can kind of see we have a lot of forest there. One of the things I want to point out is that there was a very interesting isotopic study done a few years ago that indicate that in the main stem of the river, 60 to 80% of the water in August and September, the low flow season of the year, comes from elevations above 1,200 meters up here. 60 to 80% of the water in the late summer, and there hasn't been any rain for months, that water's coming from snowmelt, water that accumulated in that year or even the year before that, and moved into the groundwater and then eventually out into rivers like this Mackenzie River, MC, and not MAC, Mackenzie, feeding our big, beautiful river. This river is about the 13th biggest river in terms of discharge in the U.S. So issues associated with this place are issues that are common across the western United States and Canada, what we call at-risk snow. This is snow that's falling, trying to accumulate so close to the melting point that it could be rain if it just increased in temperature a little bit. So it's at risk of turning into rain during the accumulation time of year. We also have land cover change due to transition from forest to residential, or from forest to agriculture, or agriculture to urban. We have this tremendous amount of land cover change due to fires in the region, and anticipated significant increases in changing land cover. We have population growth, huge population growth, and population growth anticipated. We have dams for flood control, not so much for storage, mainly for flood control and power generation. We also have water that's needed for competing interests, such as irrigation, recreation, endangered fish species, and municipal use. And all of these uses ramp up during the dry time of the year, during the summer, just like here. So what do? We have a social ecological systems model. It's a modeling framework, and it represents a relatively new paradigm in modeling. So instead of just modeling the biophysical system, we say, you know, we want to model this system, and for decision making, we have to simultaneously model the socioeconomic aspects. Each of them have different sets of drivers. The biophysical side, over here on the left, the hydrologic system and the ecosystem, those drivers are like climate impacts, for instance. On the socioeconomic side, those drivers are things like policy change, demographic change, where people live, population changes, how many people there are, how people use water, which comes in response to climate change. And so these things all feed in to within this modeling framework and are coupled in this spatially explicit modeling framework that's sort of like a big GIS in the middle there. And so we can predict lots of different things with this model. And the model is called Envision. It doesn't stand for anything other than it's what we can envision. And Envision allows us to envision alternative future scenarios. It doesn't predict. It allows us to envision alternative future scenarios so that decision makers can say, oh, you know, if this happens, if we follow this path, we might see this scenario, and we can even run it stochastically we're not doing it in this case, but one could run it stochastically to sort of look at the sensitivity to one policy or set of policies or another. So what we're doing is we've gathered economic data and social data, and we've worked very closely with all of our stakeholders to create different parameter sets that go together, or different variables that go together, that allow us to understand, to create these scenarios that might happen, that might be reasonable in the future. So we can see how that plays out 10, 20, 50, 90 years out. So we're going out 90 years starting in 2010. Same thing with the impacts of climate change. We're using three different climate change three different models and 2 different climate change scenarios. These are different carbon concentration pathways, representative concentration pathways, sort of a middle of the road and then a high pathway. And then you'll see different examples of the models. We've got a model that is sort of has less sensitive to climate change, or doesn't predict as much change. One that's sort of middle of the road that we're calling the reference scenario, and then one that we're calling high climate. And then we have a couple of other scenarios that we've labeled extreme and high municipal use and fire suppression and things like that. So we're kind of exploring different dimensions of the landscape. So these are the climate projections. Again, these are the 2 kind of carbon pathways, representative concentration pathways, 4.5 watts per meter squared forcing and 8.5. So this would be sort of a middle range, and this would be a high range of warming. And then we've got 3 different models that all 3 were kind of tested to see how well they worked in our region. We didn't want to use all the models. We just wanted to use the ones that we thought were pretty good for the Willamette River Basin. So that's the this Hadley model, HadGem, this MyRock model, which is our reference case. That's kind of the middle sensitivity model. And then this sort of lower sensitivity model, this GFDL model. So I'm not going to go into those. But what I want to point out, though, is that the models they all show an increase in temperature. How much? Some a lot. Some models are showing a big increase in temperature. But they're not showing much change in precipitation. And that's, I would say that all the models are in pretty good general agreement about increase in temperature, probably not a big increase in precipitation, but a lot of variability. Okay, so now I'm going to start showing you some results, and I'll try to walk you through these plots. They're very dense with information. We've been exploring different visualization methods. We try to put a lot in one graph. These are called the cascade plots. Some people call them ugly ink blot plots, but this one shows time going from 2010 to 2090, and then October, this is the water year, which starts October 1 to September 30th. And so blue, darker blue means more snow. This is snow water equivalent on a daily basis. And so you can see, late in the time frame, not much snow. A lot of variability, year to year, but decade to decade, which is pretty interesting too. But this, and you can see the date of last snow. Some years have persistent snow, but then really, as you move through the time series, the snow disappears earlier and earlier. This is kind of summarizes it here. Early, mid, and late century. Late century, this just shows, on average, the last sort of decade or so, from October to September, we really don't have very much snow. Mid-century is this gray line. Early century, the first couple decades. The blue shows the range of the different models, the 3 different models that we ran, and for the last 30 years of the model runs. So you can see the last 30 years, there's a lot of range, but look at the minimum. That's pretty scary. This is kind of what we hit this year, 2015. Looked really bad, like the end of the century. But you can also see there over on the right, again from bottom to top, the time series progresses from 2010 to 2090. And you can see there's variability. The black line shows the mean there. But in fact, the first decade was sort of colder and wetter, but by the end of the time series, very, very little snow. Not a big surprise. That's what all the models show. But so we were glad to see that it worked. We got the validation right. This is what it looks like over time. First decade, second decade was a little cold. Third, fourth, fifth, variability, lot less snow. By the time we get to the end, it looks like this. Pretty sad. Not much snow, just at the very highest elevations. What does that mean, though? Water deficit at the middle elevations, so the catchments where we see a lot of the snow declining. And in fact, we still have high elevation snow here. It's the mid elevation snow that we're really losing. And what you notice is that there's really a big late summer deficit. This is water deficit millimeters per day. And so sort of the biggest loss in water relative to where we are now is in late summer, and predicted to be a lot greater in the latter part of the century. What does that mean for the ecosystem? It means we're going to have on the order of 200 to 900% more fires on the west side of the Oregon Cascades, which is the wet side, the heavily forested side, which actually doesn't burn very often. But that is disappointing. Fire's not a bad thing, but when it is so extensive, it really is disruptive and will have an impact on the mid-elevation sites. It will also have an impact on what grows back. And so at the early part of the century here, we have conifers, and but whether you're looking at the reference or the high climate, you're going to end up with a lot more mixed forests, deciduous conifers mixed. We will also see a big increase in basin-wide across the Willamette Basin, basin-wide drought days, and those are defined as days lower than the 10th percentile of that 30-day period. So those drought days are going to occur in the summer, and we'll have a lot of variability with that, but overall a substantial increase in drought days. But we have reservoirs. We have reservoirs, not just natural reservoirs like snow, but we have managed reservoirs with our dams. We've got 13 of them, and it turns out that they do a really good job of controlling and sort of modulating the water releases. And in fact, as much as we might not like dams for the impacts on fish, they do a great job of reducing water scarcity down in the valley. So here is the Willamette River in Portland, and really, we're not really seeing any water scarcity down there. Down in the valley, there's almost no water scarcity. So we are still planning to live in a water-rich environment in our municipal regions, but the upland areas will see significant change in snow, in mid-elevation forests, and so on. So I hope I think there's enough time, to maybe 10 minutes or so, for questions. I just wanted to briefly summarize. We have great new ways of measuring snow. From airborne, watershed scale, from space, a lot of things on the horizon. This is the most exciting and active time for remote sensing in my 30-year career of doing this. So it's really great. We also finally have amazing modeling capacity, both in terms of the physics of the models and the high-performance computing capacity to be able to integrate these models with the remote sensing measurements. And these models have progressed to the point where we can say we truly have models that are integrated in a social ecological sense that can aid decision makers. So from start to end, from measurements to decisions, I think we're really at a point where we've made huge progress and will continue to do so. So thanks to everybody, and especially thanks to my wonderful group for helping me do this. Hey, this was February at our high elevation site. Usually we have 3 meters of snow there. It was bad. So anyways, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Ann. You've given us some great new insights into the remote sensing tools that are kind of coming online. And I think the Willamette project is, you've done a great job in terms of looking at the interactions between these different components. And I think that's the thing that thwarts a lot of prediction into the future, understanding how the different elements of the system, the social, the biophysical, the engineered piece all kind of dovetail together. We have time for questions. We have our class from this morning in the audience. They know their grade is partly related to how enthusiastically they're all raising their hands right now.
I see.
So we'll call them, a couple of them first, and then turn it over to the audience. Heather.
Heather.
Speak real loud, real loud.
Yeah.
Next one.
I'll repeat the question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is Envision transferable, given that it has these different modeling components in the socioeconomic side and the biophysical side? And the answer is a qualified yes. The qualification there is the ability to gather the data that you need in order to run the model. So the socioeconomic model, we had to go out and get our own data. So the economists convinced us that we couldn't just talk to people and have them tell us what they would do under different conditions. We actually had to collect the data that showed what they did do under different conditions, because those are two different things. And we're really glad we did, because when we went back to the stakeholder group, they said, oh yeah, that's what we did. We might not have said that, sorry. So it took a couple of years of gathering those really valuable data to have that part of the model running as well as it did. And the same thing for the biophysical side. We had to install snow monitoring sites to be able to say something about the relationship between snow and trees along an elevation gradient. So I think the complexity of the model and the ability to even run that kind of model depends on the data that are available. Now, there are other kinds of social ecological systems approaches. You could take a Bayesian approach, for instance, where you're incorporating uncertainty in your data and your model. That I think that's a really valuable approach. You could think about using that sort of approach. You could use a kind of a participatory modeling approach. Very simple. In fact, you probably want to do that as a first step. Bring the group together. Talk about what's important to them. What have you observed? Gee, what's important? What are the sensitive parts of your system? Participatory modeling is a really valuable first step in any kind of social ecological systems modeling. Sometimes you can't go beyond that step, but it's always an important first step. So participatory modeling, Bayesian approaches, agent-based approaches, scenario-based approaches, those are all different valid modeling approaches that are extensible depending on data availability.
Good.
Yeah.
Looking for other students. Yes.
You kept reiterating that models and remote sensing that we have, they go hand in hand, they depend on each other. So in general, how much proportion do you rely on models and how much do you rely on remote sensing? And particularly in the case of Envision, how much have you relied on remote sensing? And is the trend shifting one way or the other?
That's a good question. For Envision, we relied on remote sensing to provide sort of the baseline data for land cover. We use it to define the digital elevation model that we use in the basin. And so all of the polygons in the basin, which are kind of response units in a sense, are based on areas of similar land cover, land use, ownership, elevation, aspect, slope, things like that. We don't update that model with remote sensing data. So in that case, we're not using it in an assimilation mode. But one could do that in a different modeling framework, I think. So we're just using it as sort of boundary conditions.
Over here. Yeah. Maybe if you could use the mic. I didn't realize we're recording this.
Oh,
and to
right.
get your audio, if you could, there's 2 microphones. Just run over and speak into the microphone if you could.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Hello. So my question is that human population is the one of the important factor. Like, how are you including in your model the effect of human population on all your?
Right. So what the economists did is they used population trend data that are available through, I think it was 2050, and then they extrapolated the trend. Sorry, data are available. Then there's a model that predicts it through 2050, and then they extrapolated beyond that. So they estimated a doubling of population through this time period, through the 90-year time period. And the populations were focused on the urban areas. Oregon is a little bit different in that they have what are called urban growth boundaries, and they have very explicit land use planning, unlike most states in the western US. So we benefit from the data that are available for land use planning and urban growth. So, but they were able to use those urban growth boundaries and population growth estimates. So doubling of population is what they estimated.
Good. Looking more generally, John, did you have a question? Can
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. One of the big challenges that we face in remote sensing of snow is forests on slopes. And that's where airborne LiDAR is really badly challenged. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you think the potential is for the Lband Interferometry methods for situations like that, where we have dense forests with rough slopes.
Yeah, it's really hard. And as you know, there's the range walk problem on slopes and with LiDAR. I honestly don't know how Lband interferometry would work. I suspect that it would probably work better on a slope than LiDAR because you can use the interferometric, an interferometric pair to describe the topography, and then you can use a second interferometric pair to describe the effect of the change in the surface elevation with the snowpack. So you're using the same data that ideally should be, well co-registered within the range of the satellite shifting. But, again, that could be, it's meters though, it's not tens of meters necessarily for XY. So it's, it's okay. But, John's getting at the point that if you're trying to measure the depth of something on a slope and you measure it here at one time and here at another time, you're looking at 2 different snowpacks. And the other problem is with LiDAR, there's something called range walk in which your pulse is hitting 2 parts of the slope and you're getting a bias from the first return is coming from the upper part of the slope. It's a little weird. So you have a biased measurement. Now with interferometry, you don't have that bias, but you still have some uncertainty with the satellite position. So you'd have to work through that. The satellite position and also the atmospheric effects affect it.
Thanks. Daching.
Daching.
I have a question about the possible mission for snow. There's been a lot of missions on soil moisture, river discharge, precipitation, but there's nothing for the snow community yet, right? And
Yeah.
very nicely demonstrate the capacity, technology is there. I mean, there's lots of attempt and effort. You've been part of those
Yeah.
in the past. What is your vision? What is the future?
Okay, so my vision that Dr. Young is asking the question, what is my vision for a mission to monitor snowpack? So my vision, so my personal vision, not necessarily the whole working group. So I think we have to have a 2-tiered approach, maybe even like a 3-tiered approach. One is NASA builds and launches satellites, right? That's their job. They want to have a satellite in space. We want to have a satellite in space to monitor snowpack, yes. But we also recognize that the orbital repeat time isn't necessarily what you need for monitoring snowpack. What you want might be something on a daily or even sub-daily basis, or just once a month or something. But I think really for snow hydrology, we want to think about the watersheds, the container. We want to monitor what's going on in that container. We don't necessarily care about what's going on over the ocean, so why should we have a satellite that samples the whole planet, which is mostly ocean, when really what we care about is maybe the upper Colorado River Basin or the South Saskatchewan River Basin? right? So we care about the watershed. So maybe the Airborne mission is the second tier, maybe the applied tier of that. So we might have these Airborne templates and set of instruments that we could recommend to other countries or within the U.S. lend out, you know, for different watershed purposes. Right now, the Airborne Snow Observatory is flying in a light aircraft, and they're making incredible data sets available to decision makers. I mean, the cost of those missions are far less than the cost of the money that they've saved the decision makers. So it's paying for itself.
Great. One last question, Howard, and we'll wrap it up.
Okay. I really enjoyed the talk, and I've got lots of questions. You talked about the relationship between remote sensing data and modeling and data assimilation. Have you got any observations about the extent to which the new developments in remote sensing are perhaps informing changes in modeling or preferential approaches in modeling? I'm thinking, for example, of the work you were showing on multispectral, hyperspectral imagery, and is that sort of feeding into new generations of models, or maybe preferring particular levels of model complexity that perhaps weren't feasible before?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it depends on what kind of model you're thinking about. So the question is remote sensing feeding into or changing the levels of complexity of models, and if so, how? So I hope I paraphrased that correctly. It depends on the kind. Yeah, okay, so it depends on the kind of model you're looking at. If it's a snow hydrology model, it's pretty simple data assimilation. Really, they're just assimilating albedo and snow cover extent, fractional snow cover extent, and to some extent, what's called the radiative forcing. If you can tease out the dust and soot component, that tells you something again about how that might be warming up the snow in addition to the grain size component. So that the whole radiation part that's the new part. That's pretty cool to be able to use remote sensing to inform a model about how radiation should be absorbed by the snowpack in that model. That's new. The snow cover extent, the fractional snow covered area, that's definitely improved the models, being able to map patchy snow as opposed to just saying, oh, it's 0. You can say, you know, it's 40%, because anything less than 50 would previously be mapped as 0. And now we can really map 40% snow and really map 70% snow. So that's been a great. But other models, like land surface models, have not been able to, that I've seen to some extent, have not, in more of an operational sense, incorporated things like fractional snow covered area and measurements of snow albedo. Yeah, I guess some have used albedo, but some are using more sort of the basic top of the atmosphere radiative fluxes, and not actually turning those into geophysical parameters. So I think it depends on what kind of model you're talking about and the way that it's actually assimilated. Is it assimilation, or is it just like an updating? So.
Good. Well, thank you very much. So before we thank Anne for a really stimulating talk, I think, I wanted to remind you, next week we'll be back here at the same time. We'll have Sally Thompson from UC Berkeley joining us. And also, we're all heading over to Alexander's now to talk snow. And we have a table in the upper level, so please join us if you'd like to have a beer or a Coke or something with us. And thank you very much again, Anne, for really a stimulating talk and a great day visit. Thanks.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much.